She was more than just the woman beside Merle Haggard. She was a voice, a songwriter, and a survivor. Leona Williams spent decades in the shadows of country music's biggest legends, her talent often overlooked, her story barely told. While Merle basked in the spotlight, Leona carried a quiet burden of love, sacrifice, and truths she was never allowed to speak. But now, at 82, with nothing left to prove and no one left to protect, she's breaking her silence. For the first time, Leona is pulling back the curtain on a life lived in the margins of country fame and on a marriage that nearly broke her. What she reveals about Merle Haggard will challenge everything fans thought they knew, and what happens next will change the way we remember them both. Before the spotlight, before Merle, before the heartbreak, there was a girl in Vienna, Missouri, who simply loved to sing. Leona Belle Helton was born on January 7, 1943, into a family that lived hard, prayed often, and found joy in music. Her childhood home was always buzzing with radio tunes and gospel harmonies, and by the time Leona was just 15, she had her own radio show on KWOS in Jefferson City. Her voice had that old soul quality, something raw and honest that made people stop and listen. But back then, the country music world wasn't built for women like Leona. Talented, outspoken, and fiercely driven. Nashville had its queens, but they were often molded by producers and kept in their place. Leona didn't want to be anyone's puppet. She wrote her own songs, played her own instruments, and she refused to be boxed in. Her earliest years were spent performing in honky-tonks and roadside venues, sharpening her voice against the noise of smoky crowds and barroom chatter. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. In the 1960s, she joined the George Jones Show as a female vocalist, her first big break. From there, she began earning respect as both a singer and a songwriter. It wasn't long before her lyrics were being noticed by major artists, and her reputation for sharp, emotionally honest songwriting started to spread behind the scenes. She wasn't flashy, she wasn't chasing fame, she was just a woman trying to make a living doing what she loved. But even as her star slowly rose, Leona felt the pressure that came with being a woman in country music. The opportunities were few, and the expectations were rigid. If you were beautiful, you were dismissed. If you were strong, you were intimidating. And if you were honest, well, that just made people uncomfortable. Still, Leona kept pushing, one song at a time. Then came her debut solo album, San Quentin's First Lady, a gutsy move. Most artists wouldn't dream of recording a live album inside a men's prison, but Leona didn't flinch. She performed for the inmates at San Quentin, the same prison where Merle Haggard had once served time. She didn't know it then, but their fates were already beginning to circle each other. That album gave her credibility. It said she wasn't afraid to go where the story was. It said she could stand in front of men hardened by life and still command a room. Leona's voice was pure country, no gloss, just truth. That was her magic. And though Nashville didn't always know what to do with her, the fans, especially the ones who'd been knocked around by life, understood her perfectly. Years before she ever laid eyes on Merle Haggard, Leona had already carved out something rare: artistic integrity. She knew how to write pain, she knew how to survive it, and she knew how to turn it into music that meant something. What she didn't know was that the next chapter of her life would test everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and country music. When Leona Williams first crossed paths with Merle Haggard, it wasn't love at first sight, it was business. Two seasoned performers, two road-worn souls navigating the sharp edges of the country music scene. But underneath the stage lights, something more was brewing, a connection neither could quite explain. By the mid-1970s, Merle Haggard was already a towering figure in country music, with songs like Mama Tried, Okie from Muskogee, and The Bottle Let Me Down. He was the working man's poet, gritty, wounded, and undeniably brilliant. But with that brilliance came baggage, past marriages, prison time, alcoholism, and a deep-rooted mistrust of anyone who tried to get too close. Merle didn't just sing about heartache, he lived in it. Leona, meanwhile, was gaining a reputation for her songwriting skills. Her lyrics carried weight, her melodies sincerity. When Merle heard her perform, he didn't just hear a singer, he heard a storyteller who could match him word for word. He invited her to join his touring band, The Strangers. It was supposed to be professional. It didn't stay that way. As they hit the road together, sharing tour buses and green rooms, their bond deepened. They talked music, traded stories, and slowly, trust began to form. Merle was complicated, moody, unpredictable, and fiercely guarded. But Leona saw past the bravado. She saw the man behind the legend, and he, in turn, saw something in her that calmed his restless spirit, at least for a while. Their musical chemistry was undeniable. They began recording duets, including the hit The Bull and the Beaver, a playful yet biting take on gender roles. On stage, they sparked. Off stage, they burned. The line between partnership and romance blurred. Leona moved into his inner circle, becoming not just a bandmate, but a confidant and creative muse. But Merle didn't make anything easy. His past demons often resurfaced without warning. Drinking, jealousy, and mistrust simmered beneath the surface. He'd vanish emotionally, then return with tender apologies or grand gestures. Leona tried to be patient. She thought love could fix it, that her steadiness could calm his chaos. Eventually, they married in 1978. Fans were thrilled. Two of country music's strongest voices, bound by love and song. It seemed like a match made in honky-tonk heaven. But even from the start, cracks formed. Their marriage wasn't built on equality. Merle was used to being the center, and Leona, though deeply in love, often felt like she was orbiting someone else's world. Friends noticed the shift. Leona, once bold and self-assured, began shrinking into Merle's shadow. She gave up solo projects to focus on his. Her songwriting credits appeared under his albums. Even when she penned songs that cut to the bone, the industry saw them as extensions of his genius. Still, she stayed. For the music, for the love, for the hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd see her not just as an accessory, but as an equal. But Merle Haggard was a man shaped by loss, pride, and solitude. And loving him came with a cost. What Leona didn't yet know was that the songs they were writing together would soon mirror the very unraveling of their marriage. The heartbreak she'd once sung about in theory was becoming her reality. And the woman who had once taken no nonsense from anyone was slowly learning how much pain even love could carry. From the outside, it looked like a fairy tale duet, two country stars united by music and love. But behind closed doors, Leona Williams and Merle Haggard were writing a very different song, one filled with silence, tension, and lyrics that cut too close to real life. Leona didn't marry Merle to chase fame. She married him because she believed in their connection, both musical and emotional. She had always been the steady hand, the calm in the chaos. But once the wedding rings were exchanged, the storm didn't quiet. If anything, it intensified. Merle was still Merle, restless, unpredictable, and wounded from past heartbreaks. Leona found herself walking on eggshells. One night might be tender and full of music, the next, cold and distant. He'd disappear into his thoughts, or worse, into the bottle. His moods could flip without warning, and when the hurt came, it came hard. Leona tried to stay strong. She poured her feelings into her songwriting, crafting lyrics that mirrored the unraveling happening behind the scenes. One of her most famous contributions, You Take Me for Granted, wasn't just a song. It was a cry for help. The words were raw, intimate, and brutally honest. When Merle first heard it, he was silent. Then he cut it, without changing a single line. That song would become one of his most poignant hits. But it was Leona's pain behind every verse. She gave up more than most knew. Touring with Merle meant putting her own career on hold. When she recorded her solo albums, they were often overlooked or underpromoted. Lost in the shadow of her husband's towering presence, she was no longer just an artist. She was Merle Haggard's wife. And though that name carried weight, it also came with chains. Still, she kept writing, kept performing, kept hoping. Because in the quiet moments, when the music was playing and the demons were asleep, there was love. Real, aching love. But it wasn't enough. Friends and fellow musicians started to see the toll it was taking. Leona's spark was dimming. The confident Missouri girl who'd once led a band inside San Quentin was now shrinking backstage, struggling to find space in a life that revolved around someone else. She wasn't just losing her career, she was losing herself. The fights became more frequent, the silences deeper. Trust, already fragile, began to fracture, and the music, once their shared language, started to sound hollow. In interviews, Merle often spoke of Leona with admiration, calling her one of the greatest songwriters he ever knew. But admiration is not the same as partnership, and love is not the same as respect. By the early 1980s, it was clear that the marriage couldn't survive. The divorce wasn't scandalous, it was quiet, but for Leona, it was devastating. She had built her world around Merle, only to watch it collapse. And once again, she was left alone, with nothing but her songs, her stories, and a heart full of hurt. But out of that pain came something powerful, a realization that maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't over. That even after giving everything, her voice, her love, her identity, she still had something no one could take, the truth. And what she did with that truth would define the rest of her life. The divorce from Merle Haggard may have ended a marriage, but it began something far more important: Leona Williams's reclamation of herself. For the first time in years, she was no longer part of a package deal, no longer the wife of, no longer writing hits for someone else. She was just Leona again. And while the country music world had largely defined her by her association with Merle, she was about to remind everyone who she truly was. It wasn't easy. After the split, many doors quietly closed. Labels weren't lining up to sign a woman in her 40s who had once been attached to a bigger name. Industry insiders began treating her like a relic of someone else's legacy. Venues were hesitant, radio stations moved on, and for a time, Leona considered walking away from it all. But quitting had never been her style. Instead, she returned to her roots: smaller towns, real fans, and honest music. She built a touring schedule that took her through the heart of America, where the audiences still remembered, still listened, still cared. These weren't stadium shows or TV specials. These were intimate venues, VFW halls, fairgrounds. But in those spaces, Leona's voice mattered more than ever. She also began recording on her own terms, away from the pressure of the major labels and the shadow of Merle's name. Her solo work from this period, albums like Someday When Things Are Good and This Is Leona Williams, revealed a woman both bruised and brave. The production was stripped down. The lyrics were sharper. The truth was undeniable. Leona didn't pretend she hadn't been hurt. She didn't sugarcoat the past. Instead, she wove it into her music like threads of barbed wire and lace. There were songs about heartbreak, yes, but also songs about rediscovery, about setting boundaries, about survival. One of the most striking things about Leona during this chapter was her humility. She didn't lash out at Merle in public. She didn't air dirty laundry in tabloids. She let the music speak for her. And those who listened closely could hear everything: anger, love, regret, strength. It was all there, wrapped in steel guitar and fiddle. She also became a quiet mentor. Young women entering the industry would often find themselves drawn to her. She didn't give flashy advice, but she listened. She told the truth, and she reminded them that their voices mattered, even if no one else in the room believed it yet. Ironically, while Merle continued to rack up hits and accolades, he never stopped performing her songs. Tracks like You Take Me for Granted and Someday When Things Are Good became staples in his catalog. The world didn't always know they were hers, but he did, and that silent acknowledgement, perhaps, was his quiet way of honoring what they'd shared and what he'd lost. In time, Leona's name began to rise again, not as someone's ex, but as a pioneer in her own right. She wasn't chasing chart positions anymore. She was chasing connection. And every time she stepped on stage, she was reminded the people still knew, still sang along, still believed in her. She had broken free from the Bakersfield sound, not by rejecting it, but by outgrowing it. She didn't burn the bridge. She simply walked past it. And on the other side, she found something even more powerful than fame: peace. But the ghosts of the past weren't done with her yet, because while she was rebuilding her career, she was also starting to tell the truth. And what came next would lift the curtain on secrets the country world never saw coming. For years, Leona Williams kept the hardest parts of her life tucked away, behind polite smiles and graceful exits. She had been trained, like many women of her generation, not to make a fuss, not to tarnish a man's reputation, especially not a legend's. But as the decades passed, and the applause faded into memory, Leona found herself standing in the quiet with truths too heavy to carry any longer. And slowly, she began to talk. She spoke of the road, not with glamour, but with grit. Long nights on tour buses filled with cigarette smoke, empty bottles, and silence so loud it throbbed in her ears. She recalled how, even after singing her heart out on stage, she was expected to shrink behind Merle, literally and metaphorically. Stand behind the man, she was told, always, even when he was wrong, even when it hurt. There were times when the tension turned cruel, moments when Merle's temper, amplified by alcohol or stress, would lash out, not with fists, but with words sharp enough to leave scars. She described the confusion of loving someone who could be so gentle one minute and so cold the next, of watching him charm a crowd with a song she wrote while barely acknowledging her offstage. Leona never accused Merle of abuse. She was careful, but what she revealed painted a picture of emotional erosion, a slow wearing down of identity, a subtle but steady loss of self. And perhaps worse than the outbursts were the dismissal, the times he'd call her the help when others were around, or introduce her only as my wife when she was so much more. There were the affairs, the rumors she'd overhear, the lingering perfume on his shirts, the knowing looks from other women backstage. And yet, she stayed. Because in those days, that's what you did. You stayed, you didn't air it out, you buried it in songs, and Leona did, over and over again. She poured her pain into lyrics that still echo across country airwaves, tracks like Somewhere Between and When He Walks On. You weren't just melodies, they were confessions, autobiographical, bleeding, and when Merle recorded them, it was as if he was singing the part of the man she was trying to forget. In one rare interview, Leona was asked if she ever confronted Merle about the betrayal, the jealousy, the erasure. She paused, smiled softly, and said, "He knew. I didn't have to say it, but she wrote it, she sang it, and that was enough." She also spoke of the industry's silence, how executives praised her songwriting but refused to back her solo career, how female artists were expected to sacrifice their names for their husbands' legacies, and how the very machine that celebrated Merle's genius demanded her silence. But Leona never lashed out with bitterness. Even as she told her story, she did so with grace. Her tone wasn't revenge, it was release. She wasn't trying to rewrite history. She was simply reclaiming her place in it. And for fans who had followed her quietly over the years, this version of Leona, the truth teller, the survivor, the woman who had nothing left to lose, was the most powerful she'd ever been. But there was still one part of the story she had never shared, one piece of her heart that remained tucked away, inside a letter she never sent. In the years after her divorce, Leona Williams didn't disappear. She found a quieter, more powerful rhythm, one rooted not in pain, but in healing. She kept touring, not for fame, but for love of the music. Her voice, once wrapped in sorrow, had matured into something deeper, wiser. When she stepped on stage now, she wasn't Merle's former wife. She was Leona, seasoned, self-assured, and singing for herself. She began performing in small-town venues, where fans still remembered the woman behind the songs. No big spotlight, no press coverage, just music and connection. Every lyric carried years of experience. She wasn't trying to chase radio charts anymore. She was chasing something more lasting, peace. Leona also became a mentor. She quietly guided younger artists, telling them the hard truths no one else would. She warned them about contracts, about giving too much of themselves away. She reminded them to write their own songs and own their own names. Even when Merle passed in 2016, Leona honored their history. She performed their old duets, this time on her own terms. In interviews, she spoke kindly of him, but no longer hid behind his shadow. "We were fire and water," she said once, "but I've made peace with all of it. Her voice today carries the power of someone who's lived every word she's ever sung. She no longer needed Merle's approval or Nashville's validation. She had found something far stronger, her own story. And now, after all these years, she was finally ready to tell it. Some things are too heavy to say out loud, so Leona Williams wrote them down. After her divorce from Merle Haggard, Leona did what she had always done. She turned her pain inward and let it slowly surface in her music. But in the quietest, loneliest moments, she put her truth into something even more personal. A letter to Merle, one she never mailed. In that letter, she poured everything she had, never had the chance or the strength to say. She thanked him for the good years, for the stage time, for the laughter they shared when the world wasn't watching. She admitted that she had loved him more than she should have, and for longer than she cared to admit. But she also spoke of the pain, the dismissals, the silence, the days she'd walk past him like a stranger, even as they shared a stage. She asked him why he couldn't see her, not as competition, not as convenience, but as a partner, an equal. She told him she forgave him, not to make peace with the past, but to free herself from it. She never gave the letter to Merle, never even showed it to a friend. Instead, she tucked it away in a drawer, deep inside a jewelry box she rarely opened. But the letter never truly stayed silent. It lived in the songs she sang, in the stories she finally began to share. Leona later said she didn't need him to read it. Writing it was enough, because for once her voice wasn't filtered through a melody or a man's reputation. It was hers, fully, finally. And maybe that's why she kept it, not as a wound, but as a reminder of who she had been, of what she had survived, and of the woman she became when she stopped trying to be someone else's harmony. At 82, Leona Williams doesn't wear her legacy like a crown. She wears it like an old denim jacket, weathered, real, and stitched with stories only she truly understands. Her journey through country music was never about chasing stardom. It was about truth. And now, with the spotlight softer and the applause slower, she finally stands center stage, not as someone's wife, not as someone's songwriter, but as herself. She looks back on her life not with bitterness, but with clarity. She knows the world remembers Merle Haggard's name first, and she's at peace with that. Because now, when people mention her, they talk about more than the man she married. They talk about the woman who wrote the songs that saved him, the woman who helped shape the sound of a generation and almost vanished inside it. Today, Leona still performs when she can, often to rooms full of people who know every word she ever wrote. Young artists seek her out, not for fame, but for guidance. Because Leona doesn't just teach them how to write a hit, she teaches them how to survive the cost of chasing one. Her story has become a mirror, reflecting the sacrifices of so many women who stood behind legends and were nearly forgotten. But not Leona. She broke the silence. She turned the pain into poetry. And now, even in her quietest songs, there's power. She once said, "I may not have gotten everything I deserved, but I sang my truth." That's more than a lot of folks can say. And maybe that's the legacy that matters most. Not the gold records, not the heartbreak, but the voice. Because in the end, Leona Williams didn't just sing behind a legend, she outlasted one.